Allahu Akbar.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستغفره ونتوب إليه ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد محمدا عبده ورسوله. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليكم. It's always nice to have the separate sister sessions. I enjoy them because I feel like we don't spend enough time recognizing how important it is for us to be sisters, to act as sisters, and to truly love one another as sisters. Because we're living in a time where there is a lot of fitna. We're living in a time where there is a lot of backbiting, a lot of gossip. And it's very hard to see when the backbiting and the gossip comes from among our sisters. So use this moment to really connect with each other as sisters. So look to the right of you, look to the left of you, and look behind you. Before you leave this session today, I want you to know the names of your neighbors. The Rasul sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wassa ala sabi' jar, which means he told us to take care of our seventh neighbor. And I'm not even telling you look 7 seats to the right and 7 seats to the left. Just one. 1 seat to the right, 1 seat to the left, 1 seat behind you, and 1 seat in front of you. Get to know a new sister. Befriend that person. You never know what the person next to you may be struggling through, what difficulty they may have, what burden they may be carrying, and whether or not you may be the answer to their dua. They may have been praying for someone to come into their lives who can help them, someone who can take the burden off of their shoulders a little bit, and you could be that person. So take the moment to get to know one another and really strengthen that bond that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam has consistently told us of. So as we talk about burdens, struggles, difficulties, I was going to say it's a good segue into the topic of marriage, but I don't want to start with that. I want to talk about the beauty of marriage. I want to talk about the blessing of marriage, the barakah of marriage, but also what happens when something goes wrong, when the blessing of marriage becomes upon our shoulders a burden rather than the blessing that it's supposed to be. When our marriages become, instead of a place of tranquility, a place of unrest, a place of difficulty, a place of argument, a place where we can't connect with our spouses. What happens and why does it happen? And why do we see it happening so much more frequently today than we may have seen 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Why do we see the struggle of marriage to be such a struggle for so many women today at all ages and stages of their lives? What's happened to the rahmah that should exist between the couple? So every marriage lecture and every marriage talk always begins with the ayah from Surah Ar-Rum, which is the marriage ayah. It's the ayah that comes on top of every wedding card. It's the ayah that often is recited at the beginning of every nikah, of every gathering to celebrate a couple joining together. But in that ayah, we see at the end of the ayah, we'll talk about the Sakeenah that the ayah covers. We'll talk about Mawaddah or Rahmah that is in the ayah. But the very end of the ayah holds a very important truth for us. And in the end of the ayah says, إِنَّا فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لَقَوْمٍ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ. And in this, in the ayah of marriage, in the verse of marriage, in the coupling of marriage itself, there is an ayah, a miracle for those who think. What is that miracle? What is that ayah that exists in marriage? It's the fact that marriages work in the first place. It's the fact that we are taking two individuals from completely different backgrounds, from different families, from different upbringing, and we are putting them together. And we are saying, love each other for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Work together in this dunya for the sake of your akhirah. In that there is an ayah, if only we think. And this is what is happening today in so many of our marriages. We're not stopping to think. We are running our marriages purely on emotion, which is a fuel that runs out very quickly. And it's a fuel that is not dependable because our emotions fluctuate up and down. Our hearts fluctuate up and down. And we repeat the ayah, the dua often throughout the day. Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinak. O changer of the hearts, keep my heart steadfast on your faith. And a part of remaining steadfast on the faith of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a part of that steadfastness is another dua that we need to repeat. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow our hearts to remain steadfast and anchored in our marriages as well. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow the hearts of our spouse to also remain anchored and steadfast in our marriage as well. Because the heart changes. And when we anchor everything in our marriage on emotion only, then we will not be able to build that structure. We will not be able to build that foundation because it requires thought. It requires thinking about our actions and thinking about what it is that we're doing within our marriage. So in the marriage ayah in Surah Al-Rum, we're told that marriages were created لِتَسْكَنُوا. لِتَسْكَنُوا means to find that tranquility. When you think of the sukoon, when you're reading the Quran, and you get to the point of sukoon, it is a place of rest. You stop reading for a moment, you rest, you take a breath. Our marriages are supposed to be that place of rest, that when we're running around all over the world, when we're at work, when we're with family, when we're doing a million things, taking care of the children, and we come home to our spouse, we find a place of rest. But so many times it's not like that. So many times we enter our home with so much baggage, things that we can't let go of. The fact that at our wedding 20 years ago, we wanted chocolate cake, but our mother-in-law wanted vanilla cake, and so we wound up having vanilla cake, and we can't forgive our spouse for that. And that may seem like a small example, but this is sometimes how it festers. And the baggage gets bigger and bigger, and the burden gets heavier and heavier. And when we can't let go of the burden, when we can't let go of the baggage, then it's difficult to move forward in our marriage. We are consistently reminded about the importance of Rahmah, of that mercy with others. We talk about mercy with our children, mercy towards our neighbors, mercy towards this and that. But how much mercy do we show towards our spouses? How difficult is it for us to forgive our spouses sometimes? When he forgets to take out the garbage again, when he doesn't pick up the children, when he picks up the wrong type of meat from the grocery store, when you come home from a long day of work and he asks you, "Where's dinner?" Are we quick to forgive, or does it become one more piece of luggage that we add to the baggage that weighs us down in our marriages? The Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us to be the best to our family, that the best part of us should be saved for our family. But do we do that? Do we really save our sweetest smile for our husband? Do we wear our nicest clothes for our spouse? Do we say the kindest words to our spouse? Or when we've had one of those days where we're emotional and a lot has been going on, and maybe it's that time of month and the kids have been driving us crazy, and our spouse comes home or we come home, is our reaction, "Oh, I had such a long day, you have no idea"? Or do we embrace our spouse? Do we give our spouse that same nice smile that we may give our coworkers, that we may give our colleagues, that we may give our neighbors, that we may give our friends? The first step in understanding how to frame our marriages is to let go of the fairy tale, to realize that those couples that you see in Bollywood or Hollywood are not real. That there are no two people that spend every afternoon dancing in the park and frolicking in beautiful saris and long outfits. There are no two people that spend every day sitting in meadows staring into each other's eyes. There are no two people that function that way in a functional marriage on a day-to-day basis. But when we go onto Facebook, when we go onto Twitter, when we go to visit a friend's house and maybe the friend pulls out the album from their last vacation, and we flip through the pictures that we see, do we feel a twinge of jealousy? Do we see pictures of a couple lounging on the beach, all smiles? Do we see pictures of a family all holding hands and hugging one another? Do we see images of a man and a woman staring into each other's eyes and think, this is what I'm missing. My life doesn't look like this. Well, the reality is that those snapshots don't form a marriage. Those snapshots may be those large moments that were large enough to be captured with an image, but they're not what the marriage is based on. Our marriages are based on those morning conversations that we have over breakfast, day in and day out, that we forget an hour later. Our marriages are based on that cup of coffee that our husband may have made for us that morning. Our marriages are based on the fact that we went out of our way to cook something for dinner for our husband that he really likes. That's what makes our marriage. That's the connection that we have with our spouses. It's not the big moments that filled our photo album of life. It's the little moments that don't make it into the photo album that shape our life. But it's easy to forget that when we're surrounded by a saturation of media and pictures that make love look like this unattainable ideal, that make love look like something that is filled with hearts and flowers and butterflies, when in reality Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that the love of the husband and the wife is built upon care and mercy. That the affection that grows between the husband and the wife is an affection that is built on pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we look at our marriages as a place of completion, when we think that our marriage is going to provide for us that which we cannot provide to ourselves, we have already raised our expectations to a point that is not realistic. Our marriages are a place of complementarity, not a place of completion. It's a place where we can complement our spouses and work together towards trying to reach Jannah, inshaAllah, hand in hand. Not that we compete with one another, not that we try to compare who had the harder day, who has the tougher life, who has more difficulty. And I see this among us as sisters as well, and this is why I began by asking you to reach out to your sisters to strengthen the bond of sisterhood, because I cannot tell you how many conversations I have sat through and listened to as to, you have it easy because you work outside of the home. You have it easy because you're a stay-at-home mom. You have it easy because your husband does this and that. You have it easy. And we are constantly comparing what we have as to what others have, what we don't have as to what others don't have. And that idea of comparison can only eat away at our marriages. When we enter our marriages, we often feel as women that we can do it all. And it's a bit of a superwoman complex that we may all have. We may have grown up in homes where we had mothers who cooked every meal, who washed all the laundry, who kept the house perfectly. And fathers who would come, they knew their role. They would finish their work, they'd come home, they ate their dinner, they sat down and relaxed, and then started the routine again the next day. Maybe that's how we grew up. But time has changed and generations have changed. And it's so interesting to see how the dialogue, even among the non-Muslim community, stretches out in terms of what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a married woman? And how do you fulfill that life of marriage while not losing yourself in the process? There was a woman many years ago in the 1950s named Betty Friedan who wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And in that book, it was considered a revolutionary book. She asked the question, what defines the woman? Does marriage define the woman? Does her role in the home or does her role in society define who she is? And then we fast forward a few years, and there was a woman named Sheryl Sandberg, who is the COO of Facebook. And she was in the news recently because her husband passed away unexpectedly. While they were on vacation, he was exercising on a treadmill, and he fell off and hit his head and bled to death. She wrote a book in 2013, and she called it Lean In. And in her book, she asked the question, what defines the woman? Is it marriage? Is it her role in society? What does it mean to be a woman? And nobody had an answer for her. Because women often feel like they have to do it all, and yet they're not doing any of it at a level that measures up. Women often feel that if they're not perfect in the house, if they're not perfect in raising their children, if they're not perfect as a spouse, then they're not good enough. And that's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the ayah that was just recited by the sister earlier, that both men and women, believing men and believing women, chaste men and chaste women, will be judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on the merit of their deeds. So in the end, it goes back to our deeds to define who we are. But how do we find that balance? How do we enter into our marriage and give our all, strive to be a wife who gives Mawaddah wa Rahmah, who is that place of tranquility with our spouses, but where we don't also lose ourselves? You know, I travel quite a bit. I'm giving lectures in different areas of the country. And every time I get into a plane, the stewardess or the steward will also always come out and will give us instructions. And the person will say, in case of an emergency, the oxygen masks will fall from the center aisle. Put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on anyone else. Why? Because if you can't breathe, then you can't help anyone else breathe. If you're not taking care of your own spiritual needs and your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you cannot help your family. So when you feel that you're overwhelmed in your marriage, whether it is with your relationship with your spouse or with your children or with your family, stop and ask yourself, have you neglected who you are? Have you connected with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala today? Have you found what it is that makes you complete, that has nothing to do with your spouse? If you haven't done that, then you may be putting too much of the burden of your happiness, your comfort, your level of security, and your sense of well-being onto the spouse. And your spouse is not responsible for that. If we go back to the ayah, we see your spouse is responsible as the protector of the home, as your protector, to give you that care and mercy, and to provide for you, and to care for you. But finding your happiness, finding your serenity, is something that you find in your deen. You find it in your faith, in your connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you remove that burden from placing it on the shoulders of your spouse. Now, when we look at marriages today, and at the counseling center Cornerstone, we began the center as a marriage facilitation program with the idea of trying to help people get married. We found that there were many youth who wanted to get married but didn't know how. So we started a program to help youth get married. Very soon we realized that it wasn't enough to help youth get married, that we needed to help them stay married as well. And then we continue to expand to our youth counseling department as well. What do we see as many of the problems that are causing couples to break apart, that are causing couples to find it so difficult to maintain their marriages? Number one, domestic abuse. Whether it's physical, verbal, or emotional, is unacceptable. Nothing in our deen tells us that we as women deserve to be beaten, that we as women deserve to be told that we're not good enough, that we as women deserve to be emotionally abused. Now I want you to listen to this part here. Although the dialogue on domestic abuse is often discussed in a way where we feel that the woman is the one who is the victim always, It goes both ways. If you are constantly criticizing your spouse, if you are constantly telling your spouse that he is not good enough, if you are constantly telling your spouse that he does not provide, if you are constantly telling your spouse that he's just not enough for you, then you yourself may be engaging in emotional and verbal abuse. And ask yourself, what have I done that is good for my family today? You know, we just finished the parenting session, and we talked about how if we are not telling our teens that we love them, if we are not telling our teens that they're beautiful, that they're going to find that somewhere else, well, guess what? That applies to our spouses as well. And if we enter a phase of our lives where we say, well, he never tells me I'm beautiful, he never tells me he likes my cooking, he never tells me I did this and this good today, stop yourself. Start with the good. Initiate the good. Change your language and see how the language around you may change. Begin with the complimenting. Don't wait. Begin with the physical affection. Begin with saying the kind word. When we look at the example of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his wives, again we see a reciprocal relationship. It takes two to make a marriage, and it takes two to break a marriage. Know your role in your marriage. Know what you are contributing and what you may be taking away. And as much as our ego sometimes stops us from looking internally and asking ourselves, what have I done today? It is a crucial exercise to understand who you are. But at the same time, don't ever feel that you must stay in a marriage where you feel physically vulnerable, where you feel emotionally vulnerable, where you fear for your safety or the safety of your children. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not give us the blessing of marriage for us to feel this way. One of the next issues that we see often coming at the center, and it's something that our community does not like to speak about, but it's something that's rampant in our community, is the issue of infidelity. It exists, and it's a hard thing to talk about. But even if it's not the full concept of adultery, as we see happening in a lot of non-Muslim communities, there are so many avenues today for our spouses to hear those kind words that they may not be hearing from us, to see those nice things that they may not be seeing from us, to get that smile that they may not receive from us, to feel that appreciation that they may not receive from us. And even on top of that, even when there are spouses that may receive all of this from us, that we may be giving them that best smile, that we may be striving to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our treatment of our spouse, even then there is so much temptation around us that shaitan can come to even the one who feels like he will never be tempted. Don't underestimate the power of the fitna that surrounds us today. But at the end of the day, we are only responsible for our own actions. We will be asked about what we have done and how we have reacted. Now, when I first started counseling a few years ago, I remember that, my thought process in terms of marriage was that if that betrayal ever happened, the betrayal of infidelity, that's it. The marriage would of course be over. How can someone get past that? And yet it's very humbling when you do the type of work, when you're listening to people's burdens, when you're listening to them discussing what they're going through, to realize that for many couples, the act of infidelity, and again, it may not be adultery, it can be befriending someone and having emotional episodes of cheating online. It may be acts of infidelity where there are meetings with someone, but not necessarily any physical engagement. But what came to me that was so astounding was that for many couples, their belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and their love for each other for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have helped them overcome that nafs, that ego part that would say, how could you do this to me? How could you betray me? How could you look at someone else? And their marriages have become even stronger now by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because that forgiveness that we talked about in the beginning is sometimes so hard to come by when it's our own spouses that may be asking of it from us. And yet, if we seek the forgiveness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we must also be those vessels of mercy towards our spouses and children and learn that process of forgiveness. But not without taking action, not by just turning the other cheek and pretending like you don't see the holes that may exist in your relationship, but by seeking help, by getting counseling. There is no shame in speaking to a counselor and saying, I don't know what to do. I've come to this point in my relationship. I have children. I love my spouse, but it's just not working. And then working through it. Another one of the issues that we see pretty often at our counseling center is the issue of either interracial or intercultural marriages. And sometimes the intercultural marriage is not a marriage where people are coming from two completely different ethnic backgrounds. Sometimes it's just two different upbringings. You know, when I grew up, my mom used to do this and this, and I want my wife to do the same thing with our kids, but she won't. Or when I was growing up, my father always provided this and this to the family, and my husband barely provides anything. And the issue of this different upbringing can often cause a huge clash within the marriage. But one of the first levels of entering that marriage and trying to make it a place of sakeenah, a place of rest and tranquility, is building that trust, that understanding that you are coming from two different backgrounds. You are coming from two different worldviews. And just because you do something one way does not mean that the way your husband does it is wrong. Just because your mom may have done something in a certain way does not mean that the way your mother-in-law is doing it is wrong. It's just different. And it's those differences that make us stronger when we learn how to work through them. Another issue that we often run into in the center that we see difficulty in marriages is the most common one I think that we see today: stress. The stress of raising children in a world that we don't completely understand. The stress of financial struggle in economic times that have left so many families without any means of survival. The stress of dealing with extended family and in-laws and aging parents. And the stress of so many other things that come into our world. And with that stress often comes a feeling that there is no time. I have no time to spend with my spouse anymore because I'm always running here, here, here. I have to pick up the kids, I have to drop off the kids. There's soccer practice, then Girl Scouts, then there's this, then there's that. Stop and ask yourself, is your marriage a place of rest or is it a place of non-stop running? Is it a place that has become so disruptive because you can't find the time to take that rest, to take that time to appreciate each other, to appreciate the gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you in that marriage, in that blessing? And if you have not been able to take that time to appreciate things, look at your priorities. Try to see what can you do to help things fall in the right place. And what can your spouse do to be your partner in life? And finally, one of the saddest situations I think that we see at the center that took me a very long time to come to terms with and to understand was the situation of empty nesting. Couples who have been married for years and years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years even in some cases. And after their children have grown and they've left the house and started their own lives at college or married with their own families, the couple no longer has anything to say to each other. They sit across the kitchen table and have nothing to talk about. And dissatisfaction grows. They realize that they have no connection, that as they spent the early 20 or 30 years of their married life focusing on the children, once the children are gone, they have nothing. And so they leave each other, or they seek contentment elsewhere. And this breaks my heart, because it's hard to see a couple who you would think has that mawaddah or rahmah within themselves, that it's developed throughout the tarbiyah process, throughout raising the children, even if they weren't on the same page all the time, to see that in the end they feel that they have nothing, that there is no connection between them. that they've lost whatever building of the marriage they may have had at one point. So I know I see the red light flashing, which I'm thinking means I'm already over my time, so I'm going to wrap up quickly here. But understand that there are tactics to improving our marriage, that we can look at the examples of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his connections to his wives. And in the next session on marriage, when I speak to both the men and the women on how to win the heart of your spouse, we're going to explore some of those examples of how we can learn from the interaction of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his wives. But we can also learn from the day-to-day practicality of what it means to be married. Surround yourself with those who make you stronger, not only as individuals, but as a couple as well. Surround yourself with families who you feel have that connection. Make time for your spouse. And don't say that there is no time, because we find time to wash those dishes, we find time to finish the laundry, we find time to call our friend, we find time to watch the Bollywood movie. Wash the laundry together, wash the dishes together, watch the Bollywood movie together. But find that time to do things together, because if you neglect your relationship and your connection with your spouse when your children are young, if your kids become the center of your world and the center of your existence, and it becomes all about their tarbiyah, then when those kids grow up and leave you, you won't have anything with your spouse anymore. So nurture your relationship. Try to increase that connection that you have with one another. And finally, don't ever underestimate the power of dua. You could follow every self-help book out there. You could look at every example out there. But in the end, if you don't consistently make sincere dua, if you don't make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a priority in your life and in the life of your spouse and your children, then all of the other stuff falls by the wayside. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us all to be the best of spouses and to bless us with the best of spouses and protect us and protect our children from all the fitan of this world. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خير. السلام عليكم.